All right, welcome. Have you ever read something, a line in a poem maybe, and just thought, wow, how did they do that? What is this secret ingredient that turns totally normal everyday words into a piece of art? Well, today, we're going to try and crack that very code. And it all starts with this one big question. What actually makes a verbal message a work of art? This is what the brilliant linguist Roman Jakobson was obsessed with, and he tackled it head-on in his famous 1958 essay, Linguistics and Poetics. And for him, this wasn't just some philosophical thought experiment. He wanted a real scientific answer. And what's so wild is that he'd been chewing on this idea for decades. Way back in 1921, he said that the point isn't to define what literature is, but to pinpoint this special quality he called literariness. You know, that specific, almost tangible thing that makes us experience language as art. So, to actually nail this down, Jakobson was convinced that poetics couldn't just be about feelings, or what you think a poem means. No, he believed it had to be a part of linguistics, the actual science of how language is built. He was hunting for a formula, a system. Okay, so let's dive into how he did it. Before you can figure out how language becomes art, you first have to figure out how language works, period, in any situation. So he built a model, almost like a schematic, for a communication machine. And he said this machine has 6 essential parts that are always there. First, you've got the addresser. That's the sender. They cook up a message and send it to an addressee, the receiver. Now that message is about something, right? That's the context. It has to travel through some kind of contact or physical channel, like the sound waves from my voice or the pixels on your screen. And the whole thing is built using a shared code, like the English language. Get this, every single time we communicate, all 6 of these parts are in play. Okay, but this is where it gets really cool. Jakobson realized that each of those 6 components corresponds to a specific job or function of language. Depending on which part of the machine you put the emphasis on, language starts to do a different job. For example, if you're focused on the context, language is doing a referential job, just stating facts. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Simple. But if the focus is on the sender's feelings, that's the emotive function. Ouch, that hurts. Point it at the receiver to get them to do something, and now it's conative. Hey, you, listen up. Sometimes we just need to check if the channel is open. That's the phatic function. Think of it as the "can you hear me now?" job. And when we use language to talk about language itself, that's metalinguistic, like asking, wait, what does poetic even mean? And finally, the star of our show, the poetic function, which puts all the focus on the message itself. So here's a quick cheat sheet for all of that. You can see how each part of that communication machine maps directly onto a specific job. Think of this as our blueprint. But the one you really want to keep your eye on is that last one, the message, mapping directly to the poetic function. That's our target. All right, so this is it. This is the moment we've been building up to. Now that we have the whole map of language laid out, we can finally zoom in and see the secret mechanism behind poetry, the thing that actually turns on this poetic function. So what is it? Jakobson's big idea is that the poetic function is a focus on the message for the message's sake. Let that sink in. In other words, when language is being poetic, we're not just looking through the words to get to the meaning behind them. We're looking at the words themselves. We're noticing their sounds, their rhythms, their shapes. The form of the message isn't just a container, it's the main event. To explain how this actually works, he broke language down into 2 basic operations. Imagine 2 axes. First, you have the vertical axis of selection. This is where your brain picks one word out of a whole set of similar options, or equivalents, like choosing between child, kid, or infant. Then you have the horizontal axis of combination, where you take the words you've chosen and string them together in a grammatical sentence. Selection is picking your ingredients, combination is following the recipe. And that brings us here. This is the formula. The poetic function projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection to the axis of combination. Okay, I know that sounds incredibly dense, like something out of a physics textbook, right? But stick with me, because what it actually means is pretty mind-blowing and surprisingly simple. So what on earth is he saying? It's this. Normally, we use similarity, or equivalence, to choose our words. But in poetry, we take that same principle of similarity and use it to build the sentence. Equivalence becomes the rule for the sequence itself. And what does that create? Well, it creates repetition. Repetitions of sounds, which gives us things like rhyme and alliteration, repetitions of sentence structures, and even repetitions of meaning, like in a metaphor, where you're saying two totally different things are, in some way, equivalent. That's the secret sauce. Now, this idea was a total game changer. For the first time, it gave critics and scholars a powerful analytical toolkit to talk about what makes literature literary in a really precise, almost scientific way. But like any big groundbreaking theory, it definitely kicked up some debate. And, it's worth remembering, Jakobson wasn't just pulling this out of thin air. He was a thinker of his time, and he was hugely inspired by the cutting-edge science of his day. Brand new fields like cybernetics and information theory. He saw a direct line between how engineers were analyzing communication and how linguists could analyze language. And this gets to the heart of the main criticism against his work. Other thinkers, like George Moonin, came along and said, hold on a second. You haven't found 6 different functions of language. There's only one function, communication. Moonin argued that what Jakobson called functions were really just different uses of that one single function, and that we identify them based on context or psychology, not some deep linguistic rule. But honestly, whether you call them functions or uses, Jakobson's model gives us this incredible lens to look at language, and it leaves us with a really fun question to think about. If poetry is built on this formula, on projecting equivalence onto the sequence, where else do we see it happening? Think about the catchiest advertising jingles or the most memorable political slogans. The poetic function isn't just locked away in books of poetry, it's hiding in plain sight, all around us, making language powerful and unforgettable. So what do you think?